what does it mean when we say Radiant is a praying and worshiping church?
To me, prayer and worship are the easiest things to put in your mission statement without accountability if you do it. And most people do because of that, you know.
So many people have their own idea or expression of what they think worship is.
Like, if I can get on my soapbox.
Oh, this is all that. Prayer and worship in the local church. Where do you see that going in the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah. If your kids only see you worship and pray in a church building, then you are opening yourself up to accusations of hypocrisy. Where they feel like this is something that you do in church, but you don't do it.
Hey everyone, I'm Sean, and today we're going to be joined by Pastor Caleb Culver, who is one of the pastors here at Radiant Church, been serving in prayer, worship, and senior leadership for almost 10 years now. And today we're going to have a conversation about what is a praying and worshiping church. So let's get started. Caleb, thanks, man, for being here.
Bro, thanks for having me.
You are a dear friend of mine. So this morning, when I was getting ready, I was thinking about this podcast, and I was thinking about how long we've known each other. I had to do the math because it's been like 18 years.
Yes, it's crazy.
Which is a super long time. And I only know that because I've known my wife for 18 years. And before she was my wife, she was your friend. And I had to get to know you to get to know her. It was like the gatekeeper. Yep. And so
she had us vet you. So
which is very true. And I'm still a little there's still opportunities that I wanted to hang out with her, and you guys wouldn't let me hang out. And there was a time where you guys were going on a trip, and I was like, hey, can I come too? And you're like, I remember Natasha saying, hey, they don't really want you to come because they don't think you're cool enough yet. And so I was like, oh wow. But yeah, we've done a lot of stuff together. I used to live with you before I was married. We've done a lot of stupid stuff. We've played trumpet and saxophone together, and we've eaten spicy chicken wings and hot ones challenges together, and worshiped together, served together, done lots of things. And so I love you. I know you. But there's a lot of people that are probably watching that don't know you. I'm just curious, as I was saying earlier, you've done prayer and worship for as long as I've known you, which is 18 years. But I know you obviously lived a whole life before I even met you. And so just as we're kind of starting this conversation about praying, worshiping churches, when do you feel like in your life you were like, I'm going to be doing worship? Or for right now, I mean, you're what, 41, 42, or maybe you're probably 39. Close. Sorry, I'm in the spirit, brother. In the spirit, you're 41. When do you feel like you were called into worship?
Yeah. Honestly, I felt like I was called quite early, but times are so different. I mean, at the time when I felt a call to worship, I had no idea that there was any type of ministry vocation connected to worship. I mean, I didn't know a single paid worship leader. The thought was if I wanted to do worship, then maybe I could be, in a worship leader's band, or I saw Delirious and Matt Redman. That's kind of that era when I started encountering the Lord, experiencing Him, and feeling that call to worship. That was kind of the only outlet. So my heart wanted to do that, but I felt like even as a young teen, I would just say, well, maybe, I'll be a music teacher. I tried to kind of practically figure out what I could do, but my heart for worship, I remember as young as 10 and 11 years old, and a lot of it was that was the first time that I experienced the presence of God, and was in worship, and through worship services and worship songs, and then myself playing instruments and worshiping in my room or at our family piano. And I always just had a sense of, this is who I am. This is what I want to do. And so I was on the worship team starting at 10 years old at my parents' church. But then when I was 14 was when I started to lead worship at our church. And when I was 15, 16, our worship leader at my parents' church, Life Church in upstate New York, he was part-time, so his job relocated him. And so from 16 to 18, that's when I started leading. I was the worship leader at our church from 16 to 18 before I moved to Kansas City. And so I would say, 10 and 11 was really when, even if I didn't have language for it, that's when I really felt like this is who I am. Like, God made me to worship. Like, that just connected with my spirit and my heart at 10, even before my mind even kind of fully knew what was happening.
that's young. Like, did you have anything even before that you were thinking you'd do with your life? Like,
no, I mean, I would always just lie if someone was like, what do you want to be? And it was like, I started with firefighter because then everyone's like, oh, that's so noble. And so I was like, that's cool. But then I realized when I told people that I wanted to be a pastor, like my dad, then people were like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. So it was just really like, I just told people that as my answer. And inside I was just like, I have no idea. So
yeah, that's amazing. I was probably like 12, I think, when I felt like I was called into, or when I knew the Lord told me, and I knew that I was going to go into full-time ministry. Didn't know what that was going to be like, but about 12, I was going to be in the military before. Even at a young age, I was like a whole family, but I didn't really play music. I played literally like trumpet, and I was like told I was going to be a worship leader. I was like, I don't know many people that can play a trumpet and lead at the same time, but and the time's coming. It might happen, but yeah, that was the similar story of, I started playing in worship teams at my church, didn't know what that would look like in a full-time way. And then around 16, actually, was leading Sunday mornings and youth group, leading worship. And then also moved to Kansas City. We worked together in Kansas City and worshiped together. And so, you're kind of saying 10 years old, felt the okay, I think this is the direction my life is going. This is what the Lord's calling me to. 16, it's walking on a really practical way.
Yep.
And then, 18, 20, 25, as you're kind of walking through those years, did anything sharpen for you? Was there any moments in those kind of years where you were like, my life in prayer and worship, and specifically in that ministry and leadership, is like, this is actually becoming more and more in focus? Or was it just kind of always like, God's just leading me and I just want to keep walking?
Yeah, I think it futuristically, to be honest, I feel like even the last few years is when I actually feel like the clarity of like, oh, this is who I am. This is what I'm supposed to do. And, I think in a lot of ways, maybe we pressure kids and maybe even young adults to like have that future plan. And I think some people do. Some people have a very specific call the Lord highlights, but to me, it's like 20s and 30s for people in full-time ministry. Those to me are mostly developmental. It feels like 40s and 50s is when you're ramping into actual effective, fruitful ministry. Not that you don't have fruit then, but it takes so long for the Lord to prepare you. And it was like a season at a time, and I always kind of felt guilty of like, people would be like, well, what is it unto? What's next? And most of the time I had no idea, no answer. I just was like, I know I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing right now. But different pieces didn't tie together. I knew the Lord called me to do Bible school and spend 4 years of schooling focused on the Bible. And part of me didn't make sense because worship was my primary passion. And so logically, it would probably make more sense to study music, which I did look into. But I knew the Lord had asked me to, study the Bible. And so for worship ministry, it's like, okay, yeah, it's helpful, but is that, does that make sense for like career path? And it didn't. And I just have always had a sense the Lord is going to lead to the next thing. And to me, it's actually like now, like heading into 40 is when I'm like, oh, okay, Lord, I see why you had me do this. I see why you had me go there. Because those pieces, have begun to fit together. And I talked to some people that it's like, at 10, it was like the Lord was very specific. You're going to plant a church at 20 and pastor it for 50. And that's like,
and if you don't start then, you're behind the eight ball. Yeah.
So I sometimes I think like I think it's good for us to pray about our future, for adolescents to be challenged about, where do you see your life? But I think setting the goal, the vision of godliness and knowing the word and loving people well and ministering and character versus kind of the details of what you're doing. At least that's been my story, that has been later on that I'm like, oh, if you told me where I was supposed to do, at 39, I would have picked a completely different path.
Yeah.
I would have on my own, and yet I wouldn't have got to this point if I had done it. And it feels like this windy, roundabout way. But then when I'm here, I'm like, Lord, you are so wise, and you knew so much better than I knew. Yeah. And so the answer is no. I don't feel like I did have that sense of clarity. I just had the sense of, God, this is where you want me right now.
Yeah.
And when I was in Bible school, I was like, I love Jesus, but I don't know the Bible. Mm-hmm. And so if I want to be effective for Christ, I got to know his word. And so that was the driving motivator, even though I didn't know necessarily, like in 20 years, I'm going to be preaching the word regularly. I'm going to be teaching. I'm going to be doing any of that. I didn't necessarily have a vision for that, but the Lord added that after I've kind of said yes to what he had in front of me.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's crazy. I always joke about, two things. One, you mentioned this, and I steal this quote. I can't remember who I stole this quote from, but it was like your 20s is figuring out what you like to do. Your 30s is figuring out like what you don't like to do. And your 40s and 50s is actually when you start actually living and doing life. And I remember 18, 19 years old, I was like so down on myself and frustrated because I wasn't like fully walking out my calling in God. And it's like, I was like 19 years old. Like I knew nothing. I was dumb. And so, and it's like, so I'm, now I'm 36 years old. So it's like, I'm just now trying to figure out like, oh, the things that I'm walking in now, maybe I wish I did more like math and science a little bit, just like, because I thought I was just gonna be like a musician for the rest of my life. So I was like, I'm done doing math and science. And now I'm like, I need a little bit of math actually. I need to do a little bit. So speaking of like you saying yes to like where the Lord has you right now. So like right now, we're here at Radiant Church, and one of the things I want to talk about today, the main thing, is, Radiant Church calls itself, a spirit and truth church, a praying and worshiping church. Part of our mission statement that we're a praying and worshiping church. And I kind of would love to your thoughts as someone who, for I would say all of your time here, your main focus has been building a praying and worshiping church with Pastor Lee, really in prayer, worship. I want to have many conversations with you in the future about worship and music. I don't think many people know just how people know that you're like a good musician and worship leader, but like I've seen like the way you think about music and the creativity, like you're up there in some of the best. And like I would just love to have conversations about that later, but that'll be another time. But I want to hear your thoughts on if you were to define it right now, what does it mean when we say Radiant is a praying and worshiping church? Because it could be, there's some unique things about Radiant, but it's like, aren't all churches supposed to worship? Aren't all churches supposed to pray? So why is that like a defining factor?
Yeah. Like you said, I believe like, Jesus says, my house shall be called a house of prayer. I mean, he defines his house. So to a degree, if a church is not in any sense a place of prayer, then it's not his house.
Yeah.
And then John 4, which we talk about a lot, that the Father is looking for worshipers. And I think it's important to highlight, like, he is looking for the worshipers. He's not seeking worship in the sense of I'm looking for an expression of music or a style or this amount of hours. He's specifically looking for the worshiper, the proskuneo, those who bow down and kiss his feet, those who avail their lives before him. That's what worship is, using the, New Testament picture of Mary. But I mean, any picture where you see them falling on their face as dead before him, I mean, that's worship.
Yes.
That's what it looks like. And so, he's defining his house as a house of prayer, and the Father is searching for those who worship. And so, both of those are postures. And so to be a praying and worshiping church, to me, prayer and worship are the easiest things to put in your mission statement without accountability if you do it.
Well, yeah.
So if you say, well, missions is a primary focus. I mean, you're going to be like, well, how many missionaries are you sending out?
With receipts.
Yeah, like how much are you spending on missions? I mean, you can go same, like we're a groups community church. Like nobody puts that on our mission statement and then like, well, where are your groups? Well, we don't actually have them.
But
we love groups, and so it's in our mission statement. Prayer and worship is the one thing that, prayer in particular, you can put in there and actually have no corporate evidence that you are a praying church. And most people do because of that, and they maybe cite, a lot of Jesus' teachings on prayer that, at a time like you had in Israel, like you had the Pharisees and the religious leaders had turned prayer into a show. And so what people were seeing from their leadership is prayer doesn't have to be anything that's genuine, that means anything. You just have to have the right language, the right robes, and do it in the public square. That's what Jesus is talking about and addressing. He's bringing a correction to what people understood for prayer as, and everything he says, go into the secret place, the Father is waiting for you. He talks about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Don't use vain repetition like the heathen do. And he hits the spirit and the heart of it is that it is to be done. It's relational. It's approaching him as a father, and it's genuine and authentic and real. That he's laying the foundation for what a prayer life is. And what I feel is sometimes people then take that teaching and Jesus' teaching and maybe even make an argument to say, well, all prayer should always be private all the time. And that's just clearly not biblical. like we read the New Testament, it could be said like the book of Acts is a commentary on what the apostles did between prayer meetings.
Yeah.
And what we see consistently is corporate prayer, being this place of waiting on the Lord. The Holy Spirit uniquely manifests himself in the place where believers are gathered together. And then from that infilling of the Holy Spirit, you have revelation, you have empowerment, you have unity, all these things that work. And so what the apostles do, once the church is established and the Holy Spirit lights the flame, now they are applying Jesus' teaching on prayer. And we see that in Acts 2, right? Where they gather together in the temple every day to pray, but then they're breaking bread in homes. And we also see when they're, two of them are walking together, they're in prayer constantly, individually and corporately. Yeah. And so for me, a praying church, and there's a lot of different definitions, but Duncan Campbell talks about the 4 altars, but I look at specifically like the personal altar and then the church altar of prayer, and is there fire on those altars? Mm-hmm. If you have a church that has a great corporate prayer meeting schedule, but never equips people to personally pray, then I think you disconnect from the foundation of what Jesus teaches. But I think if you just take what Jesus teaches on prayer as not just the foundation, but the finality of every prayer expression, you miss that this was to establish what in Acts 2, when the ecclesia, when the church was actually formed and the Spirit breathes in and gives it life, you miss how the church walked that out corporately. And so for praying church, you have to have expressions of both. Yeah. And you have to have vitality and life in both. And I believe the same for worship is true, that you're raising up worshipers that don't just sing in a service and do the praise actions, but live lives of proskuneo, who are availed before the Lord, live lives of surrender and worship and adoration and praise. And then the corporate gathering is the joining of all of those verses in Ephesians 5. And we're singing songs and hymns, spiritual songs that we've come in with because we're personally worshiping, and now corporately we're singing those together. Yeah. And as we're making melody in our hearts, he's inhabiting those praises. And so it should be synergistic. And you have to emphasize, and I think as pastors and leaders, we have to diagnose, have we swung far in a pendulum? Yeah. Have we talked only about prayer and worship personally? Yeah. And there's not a corporate expression. Well, that doesn't line up with what we see in the New Testament. It doesn't line up with what we see even in the Old Testament with what's established with worship in David's tabernacle and what Solomon continued on with the Levitical form of worship. But then we have to look at the flip side of that as well. And so to me, like it's without kind of giving like one tight definition, it's we're giving, if his house is a house of prayer and the Father's looking for worshipers, then we have that individual expression that's healthy and vibrant, and we're calling people into discipleship level. But then we have corporate expressions of that as well. We can't just say we're a church about prayer, but then there's zero evidence of any type of corporate prayer. So
I mean, and I love how you talked about the two types of expression, the personal and the corporate, in worship and in prayer. And even just in my own, I come from, Midwest Assemblies of God background and kind of different other ministries kind of growing up. And just in my myopic view of prayer and worship in church, I've seen the landscape drastically change over, post-COVID, like what prayer and worship looks like after COVID.
Yep.
Even just the whole like decentralization of prayer movement, where it's like I almost see like there was like when there was the common language, a few years back of prayer movements, it was actually like crippling the local church as like, well, prayer's being taken care of here, so we can just focus on this here. So where do you see it? Maybe this might be a large question, so we can kind of dissect however you want, but it's like, as we look at like, from historic church to today, there's threads that have like you just mentioned, there's the Pharisees that, there's threads that continue to this day. But then there's some things that just like right now are unique to the church because of what we talked about, COVID, prayer movement, things like that, where a praying and worshiping church, like the pendulum is swinging now because of that. So I'm trying to piece, I follow what you're saying, I'm trying to piece together like how I want to continue this conversation, because I see the like, when we call churches to pray, to worship, people are just different. Church is different. Like the landscape is different. I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I'm trying to piece together all this as I'm talking to you, but.
Yeah. I think, we're living in a moment like we can kind of evaluate, on a human level, what we see with worship and prayer in the church. Like, I think it's important to zoom out and say what's happening with worship and prayer over the last, let's call it 30 years, is absolutely sovereign and supernatural. I mean, what we have seen, like if you look at the expressions of corporate worship and prayer 30 years ago, and I'm talking global, I'm not just talking in the US, although I do think that's a big part of it. This wasn't something generated. This wasn't just something like, oh man, if we have great worship music, people are attracted to come to church, and we have to pray, so let's make sure like we're praying. I mean, you see a growth and maturity of those expressions, and that's not to say that to me right now, what's happening in the what people call prayer movement, I believe is a correction to ways that expression has matured outside of the bounds of what God laid out for his church and for what that expression looks like. And to me, it's a mistake to say like that's the Lord, judging prayer. No, it's he disciplines the ones he loves, and he tests and he weighs, to separate, hey, if there's any tears in the wheat of what this expression is. And so I see the wheat of worship and prayer growing, and then there's moments of the threshing floor where he's separating the wheat and the tares, and I think that's happening. But it's almost like this, people like think of this as like it's like this all or nothing, either like it's like, wow, this is clearly God, or like, wow, there's being correction brought to this, so it must not be God. And it's like, God is doing all of it. And if you look at just in what the expressions of worship and song and music, and then you just look at like corporate prayer expressions and how many churches globally have a thriving corporate prayer culture and teach on prayer right now. I mean, it's undeniable that the Lord is the one who is doing this. And obviously we can get into the eschatology of that and, the part of the Great Commission and the gospel reaching all nations and worship being a pivotal piece of that. But I think right now it's important to like be sober to some of the things that the Lord, I believe, is bringing correction to But to not be like, well, I guess God's done with worship and prayer. I mean, that's just it's a massive overreaction. And I feel like it can be lazy in a sense of like, instead of like weighing in and asking the question, God, what are you doing? And being willing to repent and see if there has been error in us, or just like corporately, it's just kind of like, let's throw it all out because that's easier.
Yeah.
And I just think that's unwise.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, I've seen you over these last years just like try to, I think I came to Radiant like a year and a half, I think, after you did, and just see even just the landscape of Radiant change. And I was talking with Pastor Lee, previous podcast episode, where he had said specifically, Radiant being a praying and worshiping church was like that call was before he even planted the church. Like it's been something to build a praying and worshiping church. And, but I feel like though it's only been in the last, like, I'll just say 8 years, that it's actually gone like this, like the growth and like the focus and the expression of it. It's always been it's been in the DNA, been in like the root system, but as far as like the fruit and expression. Yeah. So maybe speak into like, what was that like trying to build that in this church? Yeah. With Pastor Lee, I'm just thinking of people, either in our church who are wanting to build that corporate and personal expression, or people that are maybe in another church that are like, yeah, I believe in prayer and worship. I just don't I know how to do that. Like, how do you there's, yes, we pray, we worship, but there's something deep, like what you're describing is something deeper. It's like, it's stepping into an identity. It's stepping into an expression that's more than just, we're going to sing some songs before the message and we're going to pray to close the service. You know what I mean? So what was that like building that? What did you, what was hard? What was awesome? But
I think what was easy in one sense, easy is kind of a funny word, but, is, it's so lived in Pastor Lee's heart. Yeah. And Pastor Lee and Jane, like, are worshipers and people of prayer to their core. I mean, we lived them for a few months when we moved here. I literally just always have worship music on in their house, like, and I'm like, I'm not that. Like, like that would drive me crazy. Yeah. But like, I've just watched them in their personal life and corporate life. I mean, they live lives of valuing that. And Pastor Lee made a decision when he, recruited Rachel and I. He said, this is what God said. This is in my heart. I want to help. I want you to help build that. And I'm going to be willing to make sacrifices that I need to make. And, he's absolutely cashed that check in the sense of like, we've made just massive sacrificial decisions that don't make sense for church growth as far as how wide you reach to put down deep roots of worship and prayer. I mean, we're sitting in a downtown prayer center that we invested a crazy amount of time and money into, that was built to be a prayer room that doesn't, help grow the numbers of your church. If you're just looking at, it from a human perspective, it's not bringing in tithe, it's costing money.
It was the first thing we built here. Like there's lots of things that happens around this center, but the first thing was the prayer room.
Yeah. And there was no, as pastors are investing their time to build corporate prayer and worship leaders, there was no like, okay, guys, like that's okay. Like, let's do it once or twice, but we got some serious work. We got to get real work after that.
Yeah.
And so the part that I feel like, was easy, and that Pastor Lee is incredibly gracious when he, talks about it and gives a lot of credit to me in building, but I feel like too much, because one, it was in his heart, and two, he resourced it, and three, has lived that life and done the example. I mean, during COVID, we saw every single morning, he was there prayer leading, and so when we called our church to pray during COVID, it was like, just follow the lead,
follow the example
of our pastor. And so I think he had laid the foundations in the church that we're going to be a praying and worshiping church. And I believe there was different expressions of that. But then as the church, grows in maturity, you have to get some foundations. And like, I don't, unless God specifically says it, like, when you're planning a church, like you shouldn't just start with
Yeah.
a big prayer room and like all your time spent. There's like, you got to do some foundational things in place, and then you grow into a mature expression. Now some, there's different stories for different churches. Some, they started as a prayer meeting and then a church. So I'm not speaking to that.
Yeah.
But I think, that shift came in Pastor Lee's heart 8 years ago. And so that's, I feel like what's been, quote unquote easy. I think there's tons of different challenges, but the one that, you never like factor in when you step in is the spiritual warfare and resistance when you take ground in the spirit and the natural, specifically for prayer.
Yeah.
When we planted the flag downtown, and it's a highly contested area. I mean, the downtowns of cities is like the holy of holies for the spirit of the age. It's like, that is where people go to worship, It's like that where like sin, it's like when you see it, you step into downtown and it's like there's flags everywhere to show allegiance. You see the actual worship of it. And, I think the enemy has fought to have that area. And when you contest that ground and say, we're going to actually physically buy land and take ground in the natural and the spirit, and then plant a prayer center in the middle of that, devoted to adoration, giving thanks to Jesus and praying for his kingdom to come. And, I think we personally, like in my life, it was like any area that could be attacked was attacked. I think that has happened corporately for us as well. There's a huge price tag on that. And I think that has been the largest challenge. And it comes, you can talk about little different things, and God is faithful in it. It's not something to be afraid of, because in it, he's working all things for our good and his glory. He's actually making us stronger. He's showing weakness. I mean, in my life, it's like I hated it at the time, but now I look at it as like, oh, Lord, you brought healing to my heart where it needed to get healed. There was broken ways I was thinking about you that you've confronted. Like, you've strengthened me through it, and I'm grateful for it. But that piece, absolutely, and like, without scaring you, you never want to like scare people out of something. Like when people are like, hey, I'm starting to do prayer, I want to buy a prayer center, there's always part of me, it's like when someone gets married, like is getting married, you want to just celebrate them, but then you also want to check and make sure, like, hey, this is going to be like work, right? Like like this is going to require some work on your part. Like,
there's good moments and there's a lot of hard work,
but you don't want to like steal their joy. And I feel the same way where it's like, it's going to be awesome, it's going to be amazing, like, that it's gonna like come with a price tag, right? Like,
no, for real.
So that's something that I think it's important that I didn't necessarily factor. I think I did. I'm kind of calculating some of the things. We're like, oh yeah, there's a price tag on this stuff.
Yeah, definite, for sure. And we're still going through it. I mean, it's still like, so we've had this prayer room. We launched in September 2020. It's 2025 right now, and it's like, so by 5 years. And it's still like warfare, in the city for sure. Hey everyone, we're going to pause the conversation right here, but join in on the next episode where we continue the conversation with Pastor Caleb on what is a worshiping church. So make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Radiant Podcast.